He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man, the dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. These old things.
All right. Johann Kurtz, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
I'm good, sir. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you back on. I think that you are you or Morgoth, I'm not sure which, have perhaps the most impressive ratio of time I spend listening to you to time I've spent talking to you. I've read a great deal of your work, gained a lot from it, and unfortunately have not talked to you nearly as much as I'd like to. But you and I have been speaking just before we went live about sort of a needed shift that needs to happen on the right, particularly with our attitudes towards seriousness, right? The impact of our decisions and how the attitude many of us have learned in education or the corporate world is ill-suited for that. So I realize repeating, the conversation you were just having is sort of like reheating breakfast, right? It's never quite as good. But you mentioned an article someone else written and then sort of connected that to a recent change in your life. Would you like to start there?
Sure. Yeah. So before the show, you mentioned, somewhat of a surprise to me, but very happy to do it, that you'd like to speak about an article I wrote a while back called "Don't Be Late." And there's an anecdote. I can't remember where it originated, but a mediocre writer writes to convince other people. A great writer writes to convince himself, and that's very much what was happening in that article, which was an essay on the virtue of being on time. That sounds like a trite subject. It sounds like an uninteresting subject. But as we were getting into a little bit before the show, it speaks to something deeper, which is an encroaching lack of seriousness and commitment in the words that we give each other. In the piece, I have this little section about the Anglo-Saxon virtue of troth, which is this notion that one's word is covenantal. When you assert something, I will be there at a certain time, you have committed yourself to something, that word and action have become intermingled, and you have a duty to live up to it. And that is part of the fidelity or the honor that you owe your interlocutor in a relationship of seriousness. And what we were discussing before the show was that many of our kind of behavioral norms, and I'm thinking about this very deeply at the moment because I'm trying to do something which is a very long way outside the corporate sphere, which maybe we can talk about later, are shaped by the politeness, the bubbliness, the kind of corpo art style of big corporation life, that lends itself to exclamation marks and passive aggressiveness and forced smiles and so forth. And if you're late, you just say, sorry, got held up, last one ran over or whatever. But actually in the realm of men, outside those protective bonds that have really shaped most of us, life is serious. And what I'm trying to do at the moment, which is to build an intentional community in Eastern Europe in the Carpathian Mountains. And I've flown out there. We've sort of risked our life savings on it. And it's an attempt to sort of drive a stake into the ground and say, I am actually going to build something in the real world. I'm not just going to talk online forever. As soon as I landed, I became aware of the seriousness of what I'd committed myself to. Like, if I'm successful in this regard, at the moment, my family already, I've got young kids, completely reliant on me delivering something productive here. But ultimately, if we do, start building and other families move in, as is very much the intention, other people will depend on me living up to the commitments I've made and me treating my stated commitments with a level of seriousness that I'm not used to attaching to suggestions, plans, OKRs, quarterly deliverables or whatever in the corporate world, which are totally detached from any kind of ethical or moral personal conviction or sense of covenant, right? This deep intermingling of one's sense of truth and purpose and speech in an unbreakable bond. And so the question then is, well, where do you start with all of that? I know this sounds terribly grandiose. I'm conscious of that myself, and you never want your commitments to sort of descend into LARPing. So I thought a very reasonable and universally applicable first step would be to make this decision to no longer be late. If you are there, if you say you're going to be there at a certain time, then you should be there at a certain time. And once I started building on this idea, the range of historic figures who committed to something and wrote down and shared that this was something that was important to them is extremely impressive. It's clearly a recurring theme amongst, you see Nelson has a passage on it. Washington was famously fastidious about punctuality and so forth. So there is something there. And I think what started as something that I assume would be a throwaway and only moderately interesting article was something that I myself found quite interesting.
There are several things there. I think that part of that lack of seriousness is that the consequences of the decisions made by the average person are relatively low. Like, really, it takes for a normal person to be honest, starve to death, be murdered, or eaten by wild animals is incredibly unlikely. It takes work to do. And in fact, most people for whom that happens, it's because they were doing something deliberately risky, right? Deliberately creating stakes for themselves. And look, I'm not looking to get into a discussion about like the history of the human animal, but that sort of genuine conditions of scarcity is the norm throughout human history. And now, I mean, look at our underclass. The underclass in both your country and mine is not starving. Far from it. They are overfed. And that doesn't mean that they are living good lives. They seem to be thoroughly immiserated. But there is a safety net, a very real safety net. You see this even in the, sort of the comedic examples of, people protesting. I think of that, rather rotund woman protesting the space program. It says millions for astronauts, pennies for the hungry, while being somewhat Rubenesque, we might say. So even in the kind of the results we might consider failing, becoming a failure. What are the consequences? Well, you will not live as comfortably as someone with a job, but the Gulf isn't all that great. You will still live in a climate-controlled environment. You'll have regular food, access to digital entertainment at the taxpayer expense. Like your life won't be dramatically or materially different. I'm not encouraging people to be neats, far from it, but the consequences of the game are relatively low. Now let's take that sort of up the social ladder a little bit. You work in a corporate environment. I did briefly. I wasn't very good at it, which is why I became a professional internet talker. But nonetheless, that same lack of seriousness was apparent when I spent time there. You have this phenomenon where really, and this is sort of something that Burnham gets at in The Managerial Revolution, is that really nobody can be blamed for anything. No one is really the leader. No one is really taking responsibility. And so as long as you are affable to a certain level, as long as you don't make people dislike you, you can kind of just float on forever. Not very much is expected of you. Even if you mess up, as long as it's not, particularly egregious, you can at the very least keep your job or, find another job somewhere else. To the point where getting fired, if you're at a kind of certain level, is like very, very shameful, right? It's assumed that you did some like crime of moral turpitude. You like did something not just kind of unwise or foolish, but deeply morally wrong. And I think because of that, it's easy to get into the attitude of unseriousness. It's easy to slip into that assumption that, well, consequences have never really been real, and so why would I carry myself seriously? I think that in addition, you look at the sort of progressive idea, right? Like what a good society is. And when talking to Thomas 777, we always bandy about this idea of the nursing home society, a culture which exists purely to shield its citizens from any form of human want, any form of consequence for their actions whatsoever. And this was sort of immortalized in the get in the pod, eat the bug, you will own nothing and be happy, this sort of pod person lifestyle. And that is expressed negatively in that meme, but positively is that idea that is a desirable end goal. But if we consider ourselves interested in not only human flourishing and humans existing as they are created to do so, but also creating a beautiful culture, it seems as if those hard consequences for failure, some would say eugenic if we're talking on a population level, but even on a social level, produce the seriousness required to have a good society. I'll throw it back to you, Johann. It was quite the rant from me.
I think you're right. I think in some sense, the more immediate the consequences of one's actions, the more serious you have to be. And all the way at the other end of the spectrum, the more disembodied and non-existential an environment you inhabitate and manipulate, the more you're often incentivized to be unserious. I'll give two examples. One is obviously, social media. There is an incentive to be incendiary, to say things that aren't true, to say things that you'll never get called out on, because it is a disembodied space. And in a disembodied space, a reckless grab for attention is the incentivized action. Another is the workplace, as you mentioned, because a strategy you see play out at certain teams and certain organizations is like cultivated unseriousness. So if someone seems like, they're not totally dependable, they never cross the line into like being fireable, but they just want you to know that not to put anything too heavy on their plate because they won't be. So they're a little bit late for meetings, they're a little bit slow to deliver what they said and so forth. And that protective environment actually incentivizes that because they still get paid at the end of the day. At the other end of the spectrum, if you read letters sent by men, on the American frontier, American Civil War, British Empire, only 100 years ago, 150 years ago, in some ways, there are themes which are discussed which are totally approachable to us today. We understand immediately the emotional profile, but there are dimensions to those correspondences which are alien. And for me, at least, one thing that regularly strikes me as a difficult gulf to cross between us and our not too distant ancestors is the sheer commitment to formularity, seriousness, rigor, challenging language for even relatively minor tasks. Now, I think it's important to recognize that is not how those men were all the time. You see this in the history of British nobles, for example. There's all kinds of amusing anecdotes about pranks and indulgence in food and taste for partying and drinking and all these things. So there's a real lust for life there. These weren't overly serious robots, but at the same time, these were men who had experienced either direct combat or had experience participating in organizations like the Empire, like the American frontier, where there were existential stakes for the direct people who you managed. And so knew how and when to inhabit that sort of more serious, rigorous shell that is necessary. And that might have been eroded at some time. Eventually, it was just totally lost. I've been reading a biography of Edward VI of England recently. He features in my upcoming book. And Edward VI is a British monarch who abdicated from the throne. He fell in love with an American socialite who was previously divorced, married to another man at that time, and decided to throw away his crown to pursue her, Wallis Simpson. If you've seen The King's Speech and various other films, this is happening in the background of those films. That's the backdrop. And this causes a huge constitutional crisis in the UK, in which members of Parliament and members of the royal household, the Queen Mother, are all furiously writing letters, writing in their diaries and so forth, thinking about what to do with this. And And the stakes they're clearly aware are so high for the integrity of the monarchy itself, for the moral upstandingness of the entire country, should such a thing be allowed to pass while he retained his crown and fortune and suffered no penalty for it. And then you cut to, today, and you just see you just see such cringe-inducing stuff regularly from the monarchies of the West and the British monarchy as well. Just the most effacing, just cringing, bending over to comply with the demands of people who share nothing, no history, no faith, nothing with you, just to secure a sort of media praise from people that hate you anyway. And it's just terribly sad. You just that true kingly aura that exudes from a person that genuinely regards themselves as the protector of the nation, the man with whom the buck stops, for whom the safety of the people of the British Isles is incarnate in a single person, and he bears the weight of the world on his shoulders because of that. At a certain point in our history, we lost, and maybe it was a very long time ago, maybe it was centuries ago, but we lost that. And the idea of a king that has been in some sense fundamentally emasculated replaced it. So yeah, I mean, the world is very different, and the more, I think that's part of what draws men to danger and dangerous places even now, is not just that the risk is thrilling, it's that the potential for self-evolution towards a better version of yourself that manages to internalize some of those lessons and comes out as a more masculine man is alluring.
Well, and I think that the same dynamic we see within the lives of individual men, you see on the world stage as well. Look at the decline in American seriousness after the end of the Cold War. Look, I'm no great friend of, let's just say, almost every Cold War American president, with one possible exception in Nixon. But look at the difference between H.W. Bush and Clinton. That's a world apart. And I don't particularly think H.W. was a great guy, an admirable figure I want to be like. But he was clearly a serious man, clearly a capable person, interested in serious ends. Evil ones, maybe, but compare him to Clinton. Really, since then, American leadership, American politics has been a circus, because absent a real threat, and it seems as if that is sort of changing in recent years, but the country was able to assume a posture of profound stupidity. Right? There was no real threat. There was no natural, I guess, predator or rival, one might even say. I think as well, and this is if we look at Kaczynski's conception of the power process, right, engaging in activities which have a real measurable impact on your life. It's interesting to me that people, and in my mind, sort of the best and most interesting people, are looking to sort of put themselves in conditions of danger, right? Are interested in, he would say, surrogate activities, but desire those sort of stakes. So look, I'm not a distance athlete by any means, but I'm sort of fascinated with these Ironman races, right? I think it's a several mile swim, 100 miles on a bike, and then a marathon all in one go, right? Incredibly difficult to do. And the data on the sort of people who attend these events is fascinating. I think average earnings is somewhere around $300,000 a year, not a direct indication of moral character, but you would assume, generally speaking, these are capable, highly motivated people. And it's interesting to me that so many of them seek those real, like a simulated version of real consequences. Now, that is not exactly leading men in the Raj, or climbing a mountain for the first time. But still, that is a dangerous thing to do. People die doing it fairly frequently. At the very least, it's physically challenging. And I think that that's an interesting instinct among people who would, just by their athletic prowess alone, qualify as elite. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Yeah. A quick correction. I said Edward VI. I meant Edward VIII. But I
I,
think
I
another way.
admire your confidence in me for being able to call you out on that.
No, don't worry. I'm sure I'd receive some much deserved heat in your comment section if I didn't correct that. Um, yeah, I mean, another way that this is expressed, I think the personality profile of the Iron Man competitor is illustrative. You mentioned earlier that now a huge portion of the populace has lost all sense of agency because they've gone on welfare or they're supported by the state or by corporate policy in some interminable way.
Which, let's be honest, is basically the same thing.
Yes, indeed. But if you go back to like 1890 in America, something like 90% of people they worked in agriculture, and almost all of them were either self-employed, so the farmers working a particular plot of owned land, or were the family of a relative who owned the land. And so it was a small unit, essentially a family operation. And so the sheer connection of the average person to the consequences of their decisions, it might not have been, for many of those people, a terribly violent society. It might have been relatively safe in a lot of areas at that time in American history. But consequences were real. You were aware of the violence of the seasons, of the economy, and as such, you see those faces. There's the famous photo of the mother sitting with her child in a tent in the 1940s. I don't know if you know the one I mean. I wish I could remember the name of it. It's one of the iconic sort of Americana photos, and you can
Is
sort
it
of
that,
see
or
the
is it a
weathered
young
lines.
woman? Is it a young woman in the Dust Bowl? I think, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, she's got a child on her knee, and she's sort of like looking off sideways, and her head on her hand. It's an iconic photo. You'll be able to find it. But that is a woman for whom the weight of the world has pressed on her, and it is shown in her face. And when you lose that, you really lose a sense of purpose, because our purpose for being here is to live virtuously, to sort of transform reality around us into a more ordered expression than when we, when we first came into the world. And that what gives that meaning, what gives that quest sustenance, is the idea that you are improving man's lot in life. Like, your actions will actually resonate out to make other people more safe, more happy, more comfortable. And if you're denied the opportunity to do that by a stifling system, which has already put such radical limiters on the expression of life, that yes, it may not be possible to do a lot of exciting things, but at least, you've got OSHA policies at your local workplace or whatever, you're really being denied a reason to live. That's the exact photograph I was thinking of.
Yeah, it's a famous photo. I mean, it's striking for a reason, and it really comes down to, well, what is the purpose of your life? Right? Is the purpose of your life to find some sort of meaning, or is it to live a maximally pleasurable existence? Right? To fire off your neurons, the maximal number of times. And if you view the point of your life as ultimately to collect, a certain number of, like doses of serotonin or whatever, then of course that sort of culture of the daycare, that culture of the nursing home, where you're sort of prevented from encountering anything negative, and in so being robbed of your agency. Well, then that is exactly what you want. Full steam ahead, UBI, and the kind of like most ghastly pod person situation you can imagine. Or alternately, if you said, well, no, man has a purpose, right? There is a meaning to life, and man requires that to exist in kind of his optimal form. That man needs to have a certain degree of agency to be at his best, right? To sort of live out his, I guess you could say, to live out being made in the image of God. Right? There needs to be a risk to make that work. And you see that the sort of the kind of like daycare model creates this great flattening where, yes, it does remove the possibility of failing in the most spectacular and uncomfortable way, but also it robs the possibility of any human greatness or transcendence. And it seems, as the feminist quipped, right, much in the same way that, there are no women Beethovens because there are no women John Wayne Gacy's, right? That you need, in order to get transcendent greatness, you must have the opportunity for transcendent evil or transcendent failure, which are sort of one and the same thing. That will create this kind of like dusky, like horrible gray soup of humanity, where all that is simple existence forever. Just like slowly increasing the amount of like just base pleasure that a human can experience. I don't know. I find it like there's sort of an artificial gap made between the vitalist sphere and the Christians, and I do think it is artificial. But I think that idea of like it is better to have a risky yet life with a chance at transcendence than simple continued existence is a very kind of fundamental truth that we as moderns are not comfortable with.
Yeah. I talk about this a little bit in my book, which is coming out next month. One of the chapters, the subject of the book it's called Leaving a Legacy. And the thesis is that we're going through one of the most pivotal points in our civilizational history because the largest wealth transfer in history is just commencing. And that's between the post-war generation, the baby boomers, and their descendants. The baby boomers are nearing the end of their lives. They're the wealthiest generation in history. And, roughly $44 trillion will change hands due to the consequences of that process over the next 10, 20 years. And the book is a philosophical examination of why things seem to be going so wrong in that process. This process is causing a lot of animosity between the generations, and you're seeing these very historically anomalous patterns emerging where, for example, certain boomers will be tempted to disinherit their children, which is a relatively new phenomenon. It's certainly a historical aberration. They will feel that they are entitled to spend down their wealth before their death in their retirement years. They will be concerned that their children must go and work for a third party before they work for the family business or inherit wealth, like some kind of meritocracy. They'll be concerned that inheriting wealth will corrupt their children in some way. Again, these are all slightly alien concepts. And then, in terms of the younger generation, they are in some uncertain position between legitimate grievances, difficulties getting on the housing market, globalized job markets, relationship formation issues, and so forth. And then also probably, I think there probably is, although it is a complicated picture, some truth to the baby boomers' concerns that these people are not ready to inherit massive wealth and be good stewards of it. Like there is a question of work ethic. There is a question of they've lost their religion in a way that would traditionally shape their new purchasing power and virtuous directions in an ideal world and so forth. Anyway, so the book looks at the history, philosophy, and practice of inheritance across Western civilization to try and identify the source of these trends, the differential between where we are now in each of these trends and where we were at our civilizational zenith, and make some recommendations within any given family as to how to discuss these things, how to think about these things, and how to resolve them in order to leave a virtuous legacy. The reason I give this introduction is one of the chapters specifically, it's called Disinheriting Your Children Won't Save Them. And it attacks the thesis that, actually, a better example is the chapter, Your Money is Not Yours to Spend. This attacks the thesis that the baby boomers have a legitimate right to spend down their wealth on cruises and so forth before they die. The question is why, and there's a broad philosophical discussion to be had there. The thing that sits at the anchor of it, in my mind, is this very subtle transition that has taken place. If you wanted to pinpoint the beginning of it, it would be with John Locke, the rise of the Enlightenment, which is this difference between the modern term property and what we mean by that, and the sort of older biblical term of dominion. And, if you think about, my money now, that's my property. I can do what I want with it. I have earned it. I can spend it. It is mine, right? That's a very sort of Lockean contractual understanding of the world. The dominion mandate, coming out of Genesis, is something closer to purposeful stewardship of tremendous wealth and power. So God gives man the birds and the bees, and the beasts of the earth and so forth. He gives them control over them. They are his to elevate into the dignity of rational order. But that is dominion, and dominion it's this much more personal thing. It comes ultimately from the Latin dominium, household, and it's to do with like patriarchal head over a house. Like it's something you have to look after and nourish and steward, that comes with responsibilities and duties as well as privileges. And everything that we don't have as a result, ultimately, of our own efforts or our own brilliance. We don't create reality. We don't create the fathers who've raised us. We don't create the natural resources that constitute the things that we're ultimately able to manipulate to turn a profit. We are just one link in some transcendent chain going backwards and forwards in time. And that means that at any given time, yes, we are the stewards, potentially of great wealth, but that simply means that we have greater duties to inhabit and to affect the world virtuously, right from the beginning to the end of our lives. Like the dominion mandate is not a temporal thing when you're in the official career years until you start cashing in your pension, age 73 or whatever it is in your particular secular state. That is a biblical mandate from birth to, from cradle to grave to enact purposefully in the world. So this whole, exactly as you're saying, this very pampered existence where you get some money and after that you can relax, that is a total modern falsehood.
Well, and I think that it comes back to an understanding of what claims are ultimately legitimate. Does a claim have to be mutually agreed upon and consensual in order to be legitimate, in order to be upheld? Because I'm glad you mentioned that no man chooses his father, and in the same way, no man chooses, where he is from, his culture. There's this, and you see that the progressive mind, and when I say that, I don't mean just the kind of social progressives, but like that thrust through history, view that with immense distrust. The idea is that, well, anyone should be able to choose to be anything freely, and that is what matters. You see this often with immigration. They're more American than you are. They're more British than you are because they chose to be here. You were simply here as an accident of birth. They journeyed great distances, took, a complicated class, and that's why they're allowed to be, a citizen, and they deserve it more than you do. Similarly, with the idea of wealth, it's like, well, I earned it. It's mine. I get to choose what to do with it. And any limitation placed on that I did not consent to is illegitimate. It is a restraining of my capacity for self-expression, which really is the capacity for self-expression is sort of the ultimate, untrammeled moral good of our god-awful secular state religion. And obviously you see that with finances very clearly, but you see it as well with relationships. The birth of this term that you see, particularly in the trans movement, which is my chosen family. The idea of your collection of friends who you value more than those you were, born to, that you grew up with. Obviously, for someone who has already decided that their gender assigned at birth, in heavy scare quotes, is illegitimate and should be challenged, it's not a huge jump. But nonetheless, it's a rejection of unchosen bonds at kind of every level. And really, that is the modern project. You can sort of track it from the French Revolution on, that sort of breaking of bonds. And so the idea that for us as moderns, that you ought to be limited by something that you did not choose. You owe a responsibility to those before you and after you that was not, sort of typed out on an official legal form and signed is very uncomfortable, because again, it is a limitation placed on us, and unchosen limitations are seen to be, on their face, illegitimate. But again, those unchosen bonds, and this is something that even the sort of IDW types, the best of the liberals, understood, create meaning. Right? They give you a sense of purpose. And I realize that discussions of nihilism have sort of been polluted by, a recent kind of like spate of political violence in the US. But nonetheless, like, we are a culture deeply, deeply kind of saturated with nihilism, unable to justify why we exist either personally or as a group. And I think that, much like that sort of infantilization, that is a byproduct of excess. That simply there is no need, there is no immediate want. And so, to be honest, many people's lives are pointless. They exist simply as kind of atomized consumers for the duration of their life, unconnected to culture. Men have been separated from culture, I guess, as Yaki would put it. So I don't know. I think it's an interesting and genuinely quite, you could say, subversive, at least from the perspective of the regime idea, that you owe something to your posterity. That what you own is not yours to dispose of as you wish. You are a steward. And you even see that with, I've been kind of more involved with conservation efforts in the US. Been working with the Sagebrush Institute, which, everyone should check out. And really the primary battle there is with American right-wingers. It is an intra-right wing or intra-conservative argument between those who recognize that we owe something to our ancestors who, bequeathed us these massive tracts of land, these unspoiled beauty. And we not only, it would be wrong, we would be, like Esau or the prodigal son, for discarding that for our own benefit, let alone the responsibility we have towards our own children, to our posterity, right? As the line goes. So do you see that sort of dissonance between the modern obsession with consent and this idea of owing both to those before and after you, and sort of the great chain of being, Johann?
Yeah. I mean, Naboth said, "The Lord forbid that I give you the inheritance of my ancestors." I wrote a series of pieces a while back, wherein I explored the question of family formation, of having children from the exact perspective you're describing, which is this question of, is there something about liberalism and the post-Enlightenment moral universe that is at the very heart of why people are choosing not to have children? To sort of poke around that issue, there is something devastating about when grandparents are denied grandchildren, or people that should become grandparents never get to become them because their children do not choose to have children. And in the liberal framework, perhaps this is a bit of a shame, but it's totally understandable, because of course the choice of whether or not to have children is one's own. It's a very personal decision. And that is not one that it is legitimate for their parents to force upon them in some way for them to have children, so that their parents will have grandchildren. But in a real sense, anyone that is sort of sympathetic to the natural law of the world can see that it is actually a grave injustice to deny people the continuation of their line. Right? To deny your parents the chance to have grandchildren, that is an injustice to them. That you owe them the sacrifice that they made to create you, those years of difficulty and expense with young children that their parents made with them beforehand. In some sense, you are the bearer of a torch that must be carried into the future, unless it is for very good reason indeed. You look like you want to say something.
Yeah. Sorry. No, this just, and this may be the downside of me now appearing with my face, is that my guests get to see the wild gesturing I do when I'm thinking. But this is actually something that I was speaking with Dan Tubb of the Lotus Eaters about. That this got me thinking, the way in which the welfare system, the pension system, Social Security, or the NHS have turned children and by extension grandchildren into sort of a luxury good. They're no longer necessary. You are not depending on your family to take care of you in your dotage. You're depending on the state. And so obviously that is a even aside from an economic incentive, it is a good and noble thing to do. But it is sort of robbed these people of the urgency they needed or might have needed to do something which would ultimately lend their life meaning. Sorry, brief aside. I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No, well, good. I think that's absolutely right. It's funny, we sort of come full circle because this is the other side of the dominion mandate I was discussing earlier. There are actually passages that like sit either side of each other. So in Genesis 9:1 is be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and then it's a little bit later in the passage is everything that lives and moves shall be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you all things. So it's like there's a whole constellation of things here, and there is this this duty to reproduce is like I assume this is a universal Christian thing. Forgive me if this is like Catholic projection, but in Catholicism we have the concept that you have a duty to have children in part to fill the choirs of heaven forevermore, for eternity, to sing God's praises forevermore. That there is in some sense our participation in the act of the Creator who created us. Part of our reflection of us being made in God's image is co-participating in the future creation, like fulfilling his commandment to go forth and multiply so that he may be subject to greater worship. And the denial of that, the denial, of course, denying your parents the ability to have grandchildren is in my mind a travesty. Like I've regarded it as a duty which was incumbent upon me since I was quite young, and I got married and had kids relatively young as a result. But it's in some sense to deny people the ability to have children is to deny them the ability to participate fully in the sort of divine narrative and journey, to embody a key part of their likeness of God, of their sort of like the divinity that is bound up within them, which is like it's sort of unthinkable. And then it has so many knock-on effects because it's really only the child maketh the man. Like it's only once you've had children, to tie it back to the beginning of the discussion, that for the first time you have people that are absolutely dependent for their survival, for their flourishing, for their health, for their growth, on every decision you make, on your alertness at all times, on your focus, on your ability to think far ahead, and so forth. And it really elevates you as a person once you begin participating in that activity. So yeah, I mean, I got into a bit of a debate with the demographer Lyman Stone, who's very, very good and whose work I'm like very indebted to because he does a lot of quantitative analyses of birth rate trends. He's kind of the man in that domain. But one thing that he's very insistent on, and I'm at least more skeptical of, is the idea that the reason that there is the overall reason that there is a negative trend of birth rates is because of a decline in marriage rates. And in my mind, that can't be the fundamental cause, because you get married basically, if not explicitly, to have children. Again, in the Catholic Church, we understand that as the primary end of marriage is to have children. And then after that, it's the mutual good of the spouses. Like that is the main purpose of getting married. But if not, then you're at least the kind of person who at a fundamental level is willing to accept these inviolable, deep, binding commitments that are made in public in front of a crowd, right? So if you get married, what you're actually doing is standing in front of your people and taking an oath that lasts until death do us part. Like it's a deadly serious thing. In the same way that having a child is to make a binding commitment to another person for the rest of their life until death do you part. And so, like, I don't think it quite makes sense to say, well, the reason that people aren't having children is that the marriage rate has gone down, because I think both of those things marriage and the propensity for childhood are sort of later stage expressions of a deep set of dispositions to the world and values that then manifest in both of those activities simultaneously.
Well, I think that both are rooted in a desire to be unattached to claimants, that to free yourself from a position of ownership. Because when you say like my son or my wife, there is an ownership there, not like chattel ownership per se, but there is contained in that a bond, again, an unchosen bond. And I think that in much the same way that you see many people kind of performatively signal their desire to remain childless. On the face of it, you have the kind of like, oh, I don't want to, look frumpy. Women would say something like that, or men say, oh, I don't want to be, around, loud, irritating children. That is certainly part of it, right? Those are real sacrifices, but there is more so the desire of, I don't want to be in a position where I have obligations I must meet. To be a place where there are things that must be done, and I am the person to do them. To be honest, albeit not necessarily the same stakes as living on the frontier, it is a desire to avoid a serious situation where stakes are high. I was speaking to one of my good friends. I come from a fairly conservative religious area in the American South. And so of my immediate peer group, I'm now 26, and it's basically 50-50, married with children, and those who aren't are genuinely looking for it, right? So that's very much the culture. And one of my best friends who I've known since I was 8 or 9, I was speaking to him about the birth of his first son, who's now a little over a year. And he said that it was a profound change for him because it was the first thing in his life where there was no opportunity to defer or diffuse responsibility. That something needed to be done. And if he was not there, it would simply not be done, which obviously with a young child is a disaster. And for him, it was very positive. He changed his life before and after. And I think that despite that, and I don't want to give too many biographical details, he was very worried when he found out his wife was pregnant initially. Fair enough. It happens. People get nervous even when they're doing something they want to. But I thought that was an interesting transition, that possibility of crisis, that like very real consequence, was something that he saw as being very positive in his life and making him have a more serious outlook, because there are consequences. And I think especially for young men, look, I can and have lived in abject squalor before. I mean, not like filthy, but guys living together in college. I lived in a place with 4 tenants and 3 spoons, and no one did anything to fix it because it was very cheap. It didn't matter. And if that is the floor, it's really not that bad. But once you have the sort of stakes given by bonds to a woman, to a family, it gives you an incentive to act that, especially in a world full of kind of cheap and easy distractions, is not always there. And so even aside from the like genuine need for the human species to continue, right, for the glory of God, for if not any other reason, it is almost imperative for a man to have something to give his life meaning, to give him stakes, because otherwise, especially in modernity, you will just waste your life. It'll live a completely pointless existence. And it's interesting to me to meet men who have done that, even men who did very well in a sort of a professional field. Long-winded story. I'll wrap it up. I'm sorry, and hand it back to you. But I think of a man that I worked for who was a collector, owned, a collection worth, I mean, to be honest, tens of millions of dollars. I saw him do a deal for $30 million, one of the biggest Ford collections in the world. And he died very suddenly. And it was very striking. I think about it often, to go to this man's remembrance. He died a while before, and realize that there was no one there who was really related to him. It was some friends, many of whom he hadn't seen in years, who had good memories of him, but no one who was tied to him really. It was all those, again, kind of chosen bonds. And I don't know, it was a sad thing to see a man who had gone without leaving anything of himself. And everything he owned, everything he had, collected and curated, just dispersed, right? Went to nothing. And his friends still remember him. I certainly still do. But it was sort of a there but for the grace of God, I guess, kind of moment to see what even a life which was economically and professionally successful, absent of those kind of unchosen or transcendent bonds. But I'll give it to you.
Yeah, there's a song I like by Sean Rowe called "To Leave Something Behind," which is a sort of like rough, like kind of a country song. But he doesn't have like a technically brilliant voice or anything, but it's just like the raw message. I'm just trying to leave something behind. It's like just a very archetypal concern for a man, really, for anyone. There's an interesting flip side. Going back to what your friend was feeling upon finding out that he was expecting a child. There's this funny duality when you become a father, which is, on the one hand, you are totally responsible for the well-being of that child. And as you say, that is a bond you can never break during the course of your life. On the other, a child is a fragile thing and life is a chaotic thing. And in some sense, a child can get sick, there can be accidents. And so at exactly the same time as you assume total responsibility for the life of the child, you also have to, in a different sense, completely step back and place your hands in the life of the Lord, like just completely place trust in them. So it's like a simultaneously assumption of control and power, and a sort of letting go of control of power at exactly the same time. There's that old apocryphal saying attributed to St. Irenaeus. I'm not sure what the actual origins are. Pray as though everything depended on God. Act as if everything depended on you. And there's that kind of the tension of that duality manifests very strongly in having children. One of the things I've been thinking about for the book is the purpose of money. There's a Catholic think tank called New Polity, which is very, very good. I've listened to a lot of their lectures. They had a series on the theology of money, which is a very, very interesting subject. And they said something on there which struck me as incredibly true. So I grew up in London, in a pretty wealthy, liberal area of London, went to a private school here. So I know a lot of people that grew up with wealth. And the minority of my colleagues, even though I'm in my 30s, married, certainly married with children, but relatively few of them are married, maybe approaching half at this point. But what I assumed was that after the ones that got married, they would quickly have children. And that is actually not happening often. And these aren't like totally independable people. Like they're solid careers, great qualifications, etc. But they're like, well, we can't have children until we get a mortgage. And, but now that we've got a mortgage, we're on the hook financially. So we can't have children yet until we've really taken a dent out of the mortgage. And then it's like, oh, but, the career's really taking off. And I think it would be better. We could get the child into a better school if we really were like one level up in terms of our
and then you're 40 and you have a Christian child. But yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So it's like at a certain point, the accumulation of wealth becomes a defense mechanism against trusting in God. And, it's like Luke 12, you have plenty of grain laid up for years, take life easy, rest, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded for you. There's that like question of what do they call it in the vitalist sphere? Like nemesis, like life just reasserting itself in a way that you transparently are a minute force in the face of, that all your efforts, all your planning, all your scheming is for naught because of the higher dynamics of existence. Like you're just swept away. And that is life, right? There's like a certain amor fati, like a love of death that has to be cultivated, which is just like a constant knowledge of like, and this is why like virtue ethics are the only ethics that make sense, right? Like consequences in this life are impossible to predict and impossible to control with a level of accuracy and fidelity that would be necessary for consequentialism to make sense. Like we have no understanding of what will happen a year from now, 5, 10, 100, 200 years from now, none. And so like, just like acting virtuously and then allowing the tide to carry where you will is the only way. And it just so transparently makes sense. Once you start living that way, it was every single one. There was a discourse on X recently that several of my friends were participating in. Maybe you saw it, which was this like thing that we all discovered was that our families had tried to talk us out of getting married and having kids young, like the kind of older boomer generations. And
Same thing happened to me.
Yeah. I mean, tell me about it in one sec. Let me just finish the point, which is just like, I'm so glad we just dove in, even though it was like probably not a good idea and didn't have the financial security and so forth. And my wife wasn't ready. She was very young. I was pretty young. But you just got to trust in the Lord and dive in. And it was just like obviously a good decision. But yeah, sorry, tell me, because I'm curious for the cultural translation here.
Oh, I mean, as someone who shows their face, I will be light on details for obvious reasons. Sort of bad taste to expose your family on the internet. But I had someone close to me who is very much against the fact that my wife and I got married young, that we had not explored other options, that we hadn't been kind of playing the field and, basically, dated through college and just decided to like, all right, let's go for it. And I think part of it is a certain amount of class snobbery, the kind of hysteria around, young mothers and getting married young is seen as, and it's hard to say which came first, the cart or the horse there, but that is seen as being a low class thing to do. That's seen as being sort of unprofessional. But yeah, no, it was very similar. It was this sort of, I guess, like snobbery about it and genuine concern, like, oh, do you know what you're doing? The answer is no, I didn't know what I was doing, but that's sort of the point, isn't it?
Yeah, no, exactly. No, you're right. I've got to think about these things too. I mean, I promise you, I will. Once the book's out, I'll fully commit. I'll full send, and I'll face docs for the Jay Burden show, and we can have a proper discussion.
It's actually, I will say, not the point of our discussion. I have found it makes talking much, much easier. Weirdly enough, not at all saying you're in this boat, but particularly with older people. Like I recently had a conversation with Paul Godfrey, and it was worlds more natural than our first interaction because we could look at each other face to face and pick up on the kind of social cues. Look, I say this as someone who is fully anonymous, no face for 3 years. I get why guys do it. I'm not saying you shouldn't, like 100. That's not my point at all. There are real advantages to it. I might come to regret my decision, but yeah, man, I'm very excited to read your book when it comes out. I'll be sure to have you back on to review it. But we're coming up on time. Obviously, I know you primarily as a writer on Substack. I'll make sure that's linked as well as your X account. Is there anywhere else people can find you and your work?
Substack's by far the best place, becomingnoble.substack.com. And I'm not posting on there much at the moment, so don't worry, you won't be hit with a deluge of emails, but that will be the place where I do like a proper book announcement. So if you're interested in anything I've said and you want to make sure you catch it, go sign up to becomingnoble.substack.com and I'll send you a link on launch day. Maybe one piece of advice on anyone that's thinking about creating an account on which they might eventually go public. The face I use is a face merge of Giga Chad with Dolph Lundgren, And I just sort of threw that together. I thought that was funny. And I stuck it up because I was like, well, I'm never going to actually. And now I look really different to this. And I'm like significantly younger than the face appears. And so everyone that I've ever met as a result of like, you know, and who I've just like shown my face to, like people that I've met through the sphere, it's the same reaction every time. Like, oh, you're like younger than I. And I realize choose faces carefully. You're muted.
Oh, I've muted myself. I just picked that profile picture, right? Which I think is from I stole it from some poor Japanese art student. You know, just in his sketchbook, he posted that to social media, and I, you know, had saved it forever ago. It doesn't look exactly like me, but it's not really a huge jump. Which I mean, I guess is more luck than anything else. Yeah, it's actually funny. I would not have realized that, but once you said that it was a face melt of those two people, I see exactly what you mean. I assumed that was just you the whole time, so I'll be very disappointed when you do not look like a combination of a Eastern European male fashion model and Dolph Lundgren. But Johann, this was a great conversation. I really appreciate it. As far as my stuff, Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube. This is what I do now. It's my full-time gig. So if you'd like to support me, I'd appreciate that. The best way to do so is to throw me a few bucks on Substack, Patreon, or Gumroad. The advantage is you'll get the episodes early and ad-free. I think I'm up to 2 or 3 days of airtime, and the ads on the free feed are kind of annoying. So sidestep those. You can also check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness Coaching. JD has believed in this channel, honestly, longer than I have. So support him. Show him that I appreciate him for helping me out early. Johann, again, it was a great conversation. And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.